More footballers tell the BBC they were abused as children by their coach. 2 claim the sexual abuse was widespread and could have been prevented.
I was about 9. I didn't know what was going on, to be fair. I knew where I wanted to get, and I thought this is obviously what I've got to go through.
4 police forces are now investigating, and tonight there are fresh claims of a cover-up. Also on the programme, the 2 colleagues of murdered MP Jo Cox tell the BBC of their last moments with her as she was attacked. Turkey threatens to allow a surge of migrants into Europe if talks about it joining the EU are stopped. The serial killer Stephen Port is sentenced to life and told he should die in prison. And the orders fly out of the warehouses as shoppers spend £15,000 a second on Black Friday.
In the south, the troubled Southern Health NHS Trust has turned a corner. Inspectors report signs of a significant improvement in care standards. And on the defensive, the minister pressed in Portsmouth over our shrinking Royal Navy fleet.
Good evening. The scale of the alleged historical child sex abuse in football has dramatically widened tonight, with 4 police forces now investigating. 2 more footballers have told the BBC they were assaulted as young players. Chris Unsworth, who trained as a child with Crewe, said he'd been repeatedly raped from the age of 9 by the team coach Barry Bennell, a convicted paedophile. Jason Dunford, who trained as a boy with the Manchester City team, claims he was assaulted by 2 coaches. The Premier League says it is very concerned. You may find some details distressing in this report by Natalie Perks.
I thought, I've got to come forward. Got to come forward and help everybody.
Chris Unsworth had never told his story before, not to a single soul. But today he finally told the harrowing tale he'd tried to bury. The story, he says, of how serial paedophile coach Barry Bennell had started raping him at the age of 9.
I didn't know what was going on, to be fair. I knew where I wanted to get, and I thought this is obviously what I've got to go through.
Did you know it was wrong? What he was doing was wrong?
I knew it was wrong, but I just went with it. Just went with it.
Yesterday, police were at Barry Bennell's house in Milton Keynes, removing property and his dog. For one of his alleged victims, Steve Walters, even being in the same area invoked feelings of terror.
Coming down here last night, our train was unfortunately terminated at Milton Keynes, and apparently that's where he is. And you know, we had to get off the train at night. I was saying to my wife,
It's all right. It's all right. It's all right.
you know, he could be, you know, here now. You know, it's just want justice and like closure on here now. You know, all this has got to be rectified as soon as possible.
Chris Unsworth says he'd tried so hard to forget the abuse that he never felt able to tell his family.
Both my parents have died, and that hurts me.
Yeah.
Not telling them.
Does it?
Yeah. But I don't know if it's a good thing that I did or I didn't tell them, because they would have blamed themselves.
So just who is Barry Bennell? He made his name as a coach and talent scout at Crewe Alexandra, with links to Manchester City and Stoke in the 1980s. But Crewe suddenly sacked him in 1992. The reason never made public. He's since been jailed 3 times for child sexual abuse. In 1994, he served 2 years in America for raping a British boy at a football camp in Florida. In 1998, he got 9 years here after admitting 23 charges of child sexual abuse. And last May, he was jailed for 2 years for sexually abusing a 12-year-old boy in 1980. He's now out on licence. Since Andy Woodward waived his anonymity last week to reveal the abuse he suffered at the hands of Bennell, 6 other players have come forward to tell their stories, including an unnamed player in the Guardian newspaper today who claims he was abused by convicted paedophile youth coach George Ormond while he was at Newcastle United. It shows the story is wider spread than just one coach, wider than just one area. This is the tip of the iceberg, according to investigative journalist Deborah Davis. She produced a documentary on sexual abuse in football 20 years ago.
There are more names. I spoke to an England player who said, if I told you what had happened to me publicly, can you imagine what 60,000 fans would chant on Saturday? There are more big names to come out. The very fact the game is facing up to it now does not in any way excuse them from the responsibility they had then.
For the man whose story started this, Andy Woodward, some sense of relief.
Last week I was on here, I was on my own, and I was so scared, but I knew that they were here. I've got, honest to God, Victoria, I can't thank the public enough and the media, and more importantly, the lads for backing me up, I'm just totally overwhelmed.
Yeah. One man's heartbreak, leading others to finally feel able to share their torment. Natalie Perks, BBC News.
Well, our sports editor Dan Roan is at Manchester City, one of the clubs which is looking into allegations of historic abuse. Dan, the testimony from these men is so harrowing, and tonight there are fresh claims of a cover-up.
That's right, yes. I mean, this now involves several clubs, 4 police forces. It's a scandal really on a scale now that few would have imagined at all possible just a week ago, when of course there was only one former footballer at that stage, Andy Woodward, who had spoken out about his previous experiences. The National Inquiry into Historic Cases of Child Sex Abuse has said today that its terms of reference are wide enough for it to look at potential mistakes and wrongdoing by sports organisations, including, of course, football clubs. But as you say, yes, tonight it does seem this story to have elevated yet again in terms of the gravity for Crewe, the club, of course, that's most implicated at this stage in this case, and perhaps the FA, because the Guardian are reporting that a former board member at that club back in the late 80s took concerns and a report of a complaint against Bennell to the full board, to the chairman, but he says he was ignored. He then, a few years later, once Bennell had been convicted, went to the FA and said that they should investigate and perhaps consider compensation for his victims. They, he says, told him there was no case to answer, and I think that will anger many people, and they perhaps will want now the FA to do what they appear to have failed to have done all those years ago and properly establish what exactly happened, how many victims there were, whether this alleged crime was in fact organised perhaps with other potential paedophiles, and ensure, perhaps most importantly, that there are no Barry Bennells operating in the game right now.
And Dan, parents will be preparing to take their kids to football training tomorrow and wondering, are their children at risk?
Naturally, they will ask that. I think the Premier League today issued a statement trying to calm those kinds of fears. It said there was no complacency in the game, not among their clubs or academies. The FA chairman has written to thousands of grassroots clubs up and down the country, warning their coaches to be more vigilant. I think the safeguarding and child protection is a lot more advanced now than it was in the days of Barry Bennell, but I think the FA realises that perhaps more could be done, and inevitably I think there will be parents up and down the country this weekend hesitating, perhaps having second thoughts when they take their children to all form of sports practice this weekend. And I think when it comes to trust, the FA realises that that is very much on the line right now, and it will have to prove to be decisive to preserve it going forward.
Dan Roan at Manchester City, thank you. And you can watch the full interview with the footballers we heard from there online at the Victoria Derbyshire Programme website. That's at bbc.co.uk/Victoria. The 2 women who were with the Labour MP Jo Cox when she was killed have been speaking about their last moments with her and the dignity and humanity she showed even then. On Wednesday, Thomas Mair was given a whole life sentence for her murder. Sandra Major and Fazila Aswat, who worked with Mrs Cox, have been speaking exclusively to the BBC. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas is in Batley for us tonight. And Ed, this is still clearly very traumatic for these women.
Yes, Fasila and Sandra were with Jo Cox right at the start of her career as an MP, and they were with her right at the very end in the place they all called home. And for the first time, they wanted to talk about their loyal friend and her final selfless moments.
On that day, our lives changed forever. We witnessed something that most people hopefully will never witness in their life.
I console myself with, actually she wasn't on her own, she was with two people that very much loved and cared for her. I'm grateful now that I was with her at the end.
Friends and her loyal assistants. Fasila Aswat, her office manager, and Sandra Major, her senior caseworker. Both were with Jo Cox the day she was murdered. After being shot and stabbed, the MP told them to run. "Don't let him hurt you," she said. "Let him hurt me."
It was all happening so fast, and we just wanted to help Jo. But even in those moments, Jo just wanted to make sure that we were all right. Jo cared about other people so much, and she loved us and we loved her, and she didn't want us to get hurt.
Even in that moment, I think she showed humanity what dignity looks like and what love looks like.
Her final moment was to protect. A selfless act that, for those who knew her best, defined the values Jo Cox lived for.
I mean, Jo will always leave a very big Jo-sized hole in my life.
She had so much energy, she was exhausting. And I think of a woman who was a great mum. She absolutely doted on her children. They used to literally hang off her sometimes.
And what thoughts now for Thomas Mair, the man sentenced to life in prison?
He's never spoken about what his particular motives are. I think it's clear that he had far-right views. But I think to try and get into the mind of a callous murderer is not something that is healthy or that people should consume their energy on.
He was a very evil person for what he did, and I think that Jo was an amazing person and they were polar opposites.
As a mum, it's very difficult to absorb that somebody would be capable of... sorry.
That's okay. It's okay.
So, so for me, it's the hardest thing is her children won't have her mum.
And it said to all the people that it went past.
Out of hatred and evil has risen so much love and support, and that has been so wonderful that so many people loved Jo and really cared about her.
The voice of Sandra Major ending that report from Ed Thomas. Turkey's president has threatened to allow hundreds of thousands of migrants to cross the border into Europe after the European Parliament voted to suspend talks on Turkey joining the EU. Fewer migrants have been crossing the Mediterranean since a deal in March between Turkey and the EU, limiting the numbers entering Europe. From Istanbul, our correspondent Mark Lowen reports.
It was Europe's worst migration crisis since the Second World War. Over 1 million fleeing war and poverty for Europe. Many never made it, and as deaths mounted and fences went up, the EU was plunged into crisis. This was a fix of sorts, a deal with Turkey last March to deport some back here. Mainly Pakistanis have been sent back so far. Along with border closures in the Balkans, it stemmed the flow. But now Turkey's president has hit out at Europe, threatening to undo the deal and send migrants back.
You have said in the past, what will we do if Turkey opens the borders? Well, if you go any further, those border gates will be opened.
The parliament vote on Turkey was non-binding, and EU leaders are unlikely to heed it, fearful of alienating a vital ally. But there's anger in Brussels at what some see as blackmail by Mr. Erdogan, whose politics they don't like.
No political opposition, is that a democracy? No. No press freedom, is it a democracy? No. Should the EU negotiate with countries that are not democracies anymore? My answer is no.
Turkey hosts 3 million migrants, but many are integrated and will stay. For others, though, the dream of Europe is still there.
if the borders are open, maybe after 1 month, 2 months, or maybe after the winter, yeah, they will go. They will not stay here.
But not you?
No, not for me actually.
You want to stay here?
Yeah, I want to stay here.
I'd like to go to England, he says, but it would be hard. If the borders opened, everyone would try to go to Europe. But I do like life in Turkey. It's given us everything.
There is always a lot for domestic consumption in President Erdogan's rhetoric. His combative tone is often not followed up by action. But he does hold the trump card with Europe on the migrant deal, and even threatening to play it will send shivers to Brussels and Berlin.
The EU needs Turkey despite the bad blood. The migrants have become a bargaining chip. A nervous Europe now waits to see if Turkey's strongman leader will unleash his fury. Mark Lowen, BBC News, Istanbul.
Let's take a brief look at some of the day's other news stories. Jaguar Land Rover has suggested it could create thousands of jobs in the West Midlands if the government agrees to new investment. Its chief executive says electric vehicles could be produced here if there are significant improvements to infrastructure. A man's been jailed for 8.5 years for blackmailing Muslim women using intimate photos and videos he took of them without their knowledge. 38-year-old Farhan Mirza from Abitilleri secretly filmed the women and threatened to share the footage if they didn't give him money. Police in Israel have arrested 12 people for arson as firefighters tackle wildfires that have been burning for 4 days. Officials say that more than half of them were started deliberately. The fires have now largely been brought under control with the help of specialist aircraft from overseas. The serial killer Stephen Port has been told by a judge he should die in prison after being found guilty of murdering 4 gay men he met online. The 41-year-old chef drugged his victims with lethal doses and left them to die. The police watchdog is now investigating why detectives failed initially to link the deaths of the 4 men whose bodies were all found near Port's home over a 15-month period. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford reports.
Convicted on Wednesday of the serial killing of 4 young men, today Stephen Port was told he would never be released from prison. There were cheers from the public gallery and relief from the dead men's families.
We finally have justice for our Jack and the other boys. That sick, twisted scumbag will never be able to hurt or destroy anyone else's family or life. Our Jack can finally rest in peace. We will always be completely heartbroken as a family.
It's what we wanted. Just to make sure that he can't get out. He's not safe to come out ever. And yeah, we're very relieved.
Mr. Justice Openshaw told the court he was passing a whole life sentence and the defendant will die in prison. The judge said Port was a highly dangerous man who had abandoned the bodies of his victims in a way that robbed them of their dignity and had then told wicked and monstrous lies to cover up his killings. The men he murdered were all just starting their adult lives. He killed them all within 15 months, luring them back to his flat, drugging them to have sex with them and then dumping their bodies. He left 3 of them at this churchyard in Barking, but local detectives missed all the signs of a serial killer stalking their borough. For example, on the 3rd man to die, Daniel Whitworth, there was what seemed to be a suicide note. His family warned the police they weren't at all sure it was his handwriting. They say detectives promised they would get an expert to check it, but they never did.
There was nothing in there that would link it to Daniel. There was nothing personal about it. There were no names mentioned.
The note was in fact written by Stephen Port, and if detectives had checked it, they would have found his DNA on the cover. It was one of a catalogue of errors, and 1 year later, Port killed his 4th victim, Jack Taylor. Daniel Sandford, BBC News.
The Prime Minister of Malta, whose country is about to take over the EU presidency, says European leaders aren't bluffing about Brexit. Joseph Muscat told the BBC that the UK wouldn't have access to the single market without accepting EU citizens' rights to live and work in Britain. He also warned that even when a deal is reached with the UK, it could be vetoed by the European Parliament. A nurse accused of giving a falsely low temperature reading of her colleague Pauline Kafaki, who had Ebola, has been suspended for 2 months. A disciplinary panel had found that Donna Wood, a senior nurse, dishonestly suggested that Ms Kafaki's temperature was lower than it actually was during an airport screening after they returned from Sierra Leone. Ms Kafaki became ill with Ebola shortly afterwards. The contest to be the centre-right presidential candidate in France comes to a head this weekend. François Fillon and Alain Juppé, both former prime ministers, are offering a choice between stringent cuts to public spending or more moderate reforms. Whoever wins is expected to take on the far-right Marine Le Pen in presidential elections next spring. Our Paris correspondent Lucy Williamson reports.
As racing drivers know, your starting position doesn't always determine the race. And François Fillon, born in Le Mans, is a keen amateur driver. He last raced this track in July, and no, he didn't win. Here, as in politics, there are risks in going too fast or too slow, and attacking your opponent can be fatal to either party. It says something about this primary contest that the tetchiest exchange in last night's debate was over abortion, even though neither candidate wants to change the law. Mr Juppé demanded that his rival clarify his personal views on it. My conscience is my business, Mr Fillon has said, and I think the trial against me is unfair. Mr Juppé has presented his opponent as a Catholic conservative with appeal on the far right, calling Mr Fillon's views on the family all but backward. A call, some say, to centrist, even left-wing voters to take part in Sunday's runoff. The truth is that both men agree on the need for spending cuts, longer working hours and economic reform. The differences there are largely a matter of degree. But they seem to be speaking to two different audiences in France. Alain Juppé has been talking about harmony, inclusiveness and a happy national identity. His rival says the country is angry and fed up and wants radical change. The winner is expected to battle far-right leader Marine Le Pen for the presidency next year. Would she prefer a rival who could pull in left-wing votes, or one who might pull in some of hers? At a final rally of supporters tonight, François Fillon said he'd been presented over the past week as a reactionary monster. He's also been tipped as the favourite to win. If he does, there are 5 more months to go before presidential elections begin. And even for a man from Le Mans, that's a long race. Lucy Williamson, BBC News, Paris.
It's the US shopping craze now firmly established in the British retail calendar. Black Friday offers discounts on products ranging from electrical goods, clothing, footwear to furniture in the lead up to Christmas Day, which is just a month today. Initial reports suggest spending is up on last year. There's some retailers say it's not a profitable event and so they're not taking part. Our business correspondent Emma Simpson has more.
Black Friday in America today and the usual bun fight over bargains. We had our own Black Friday brawls 2 years ago after importing this phenomenon, but not anymore. Trafford Tesco at 5 a.m. The few that did turn up knew what they wanted.
Yes, I got a lovely TV, I'm very happy.
Instead, millions of us went online.
It's much easier just to sit down with your laptop rather than having to get up and go out. I feel lazy.
Erin from Watford, bagging a bargain at breakfast.
I reckon I spend more money because it's more tempting when you see how much money you're saving.
Her order is being processed here at Argos, along with a few others. In fact, they reckon today will be their biggest sales day ever. Overall, it's predicted that more than £1.2 billion will be spent on UK online sales alone by the end of today, a rise of 16% on last year. That's £15,000 a second.
It feels like Black Friday has been going on forever. We've now had 2 weeks of promotions with more days still to come. Even so, we're still expected to spend more this actual Friday than we did last year.
Could we be splurging now for fear of price hikes next year, thanks to the fall in the pound after the Brexit vote? The boss here thinks it's less complicated.
I think consumers have had a tough year, actually. They've had a tough couple of years. And I think what we always see this time of year is customers do love Christmas.
But the boss of this chain thinks all this discounting is bad for the industry, and he's not joining in.
We like to create beautiful products that people enjoy. We like everyone to have an amazing Christmas. And this idea that it gets commoditised by discount, the idea that it's not really worth what it was in the first place, the idea that customers trying to work out if something they bought last week is at the right price or the wrong price, it just devalues everything.
Like it or loathe it, Black Friday has changed the way we shop before Christmas. An extraordinary shift in just a few years. Emma Simpson, BBC News.
That's it. Now, BBC One, it's time for news where you are. Have a good night and a good weekend.